Michigan against Washington. The countdown is on, and the countdown continues for transfer portal quarterbacks, and we are on our way to Houston. This is the College Game Day Podcast for Thursday, January 4th, 2024. Michigan and Washington, the last two undefeated teams standing. Darlings of destiny, and a team that has overcome myriad off-the-field situations to prevail in cathartic victories in the college football playoff semifinals. Rece Davis and Pete Thamel with you. So, Pete, as we get started, we parted ways as I went to the Red Eye and experienced Texas and Washington on my phone and in the Delta Sky Club, which is a little not my preferred way to consume games live, though I have gone back and watched some more since then. But it was a fascinating thing to not really be able to hear Sean McDonough and Greg McElroy in the moment, and then see Dylan Johnson go down at the end when the clock was running, and you're like, sure. Your first instinct was, oh no. If you have a pulse, crawl off of that field.
Yes, it's a terrible thought, isn't it? Like you felt like a bad human.
I felt like a bad person, no doubt. And
bear crawl.
You said, man, I hope. And then you're like, man, I hope he's not hurt badly. And I will confess, and I don't want this misunderstood as some criticism of Dylan Johnson, who's a terrific player and was obviously in a great deal of agony. But I was a mixture of relieved and thought, what were you doing? When I saw him standing on the sideline later during their final drive. I'm glad he's okay. Kalen DeBoer says he's expected to play. But what absolute drama. I know you've talked about it on the pod, but I haven't had a chance to talk to you about it. What wild drama, and sort of a fitting way for Washington to get to this championship game by finding yet another way to win a game. I started saying another way to escape, but I'm going to change my terminology and say finding yet another way to win a game and win a close one, which has become their calling card this year.
Yes, all 85 Huskies should get graduate degrees in drama because they have earned it with honors, magna cum laude, or whatever Latin term is for really, really good at drama, because they have been consistently unbelievable, consistently clutch. You could do a one shining moment of their late game heroics going back all the way through. Obviously, I think the defining play of their season is that Washington State reverse on 4th and 1 when they were backed up in the shadow of their own goal is an exaggeration. But for 4th down going for it, it's about as minus territory as you can do it. And there they were again. We said this on the pod the other day, Rece, but you'd be amused to know after we shut the TV off and started to tape, because we wanted to get out of the Rose Bowl. We were in a radio box. Mm-hmm. And then I looked down at my phone and said, let's make sure the game is over. And it was like, oh, no, it's not over. Someone looked at Twitter and said, if Washington loses, the Dylan Johnson injury would be one of the weirdest way. And I was like, oh, because we just did the math and was like, oh, there'll be 10 seconds left. This shouldn't be a problem. So I am almost sort of as a human, grateful for Kalen DeBoer and Dylan Johnson that it didn't end that way, because what a just awful way to go on a high stakes stage that would have been. And that's no slight on Texas, who played really well and valiantly pushed the ball down the field twice in the last 2 minutes and had, what was the stat? They had 12 plays inside the 15 and scored 3 points in the last 2 minutes. I mean, just a wild sequence of events. But just a very fitting capper, and they can flip their tassel now with drama graduation on Monday in Houston.
Well, I know that there are so many concerns over feigning injuries to be able to preserve the clock, stop the clock, do the different things, and they're the 10-second runoff. And obviously, Texas wouldn't want anything like that in the situation. But I've been churning through all of the scenarios and the complications and the what ifs that you might not have thought of, that the rules committee always does seem to think of, and you wonder if there was some way to handle that, because that seemed unfortunate and borderline unfair in some ways. But I'm sure that I'll continue to churn. It hasn't been atop my mind, but it's things I've been churning through. Is I wonder if they're going to somehow address that clock issue, because it saved about 30 seconds, I think, or something like that.
I mean, a lot of real estate.
Yeah, but anyway, it all came out in the wash, and Texas played valiantly. And I do think that once again, Pete, in that game, and it might be something that we see pop up in Houston on Monday night, the Washington offensive line answered the bell, and they took umbrage at the fact that they had been considered not as physical or tough as the Oregon defensive front. And then they heard for a month about how the whole game, and their only chance, if they could keep those two, massive Texas defensive linemen, who are great, by the way, if they could keep them from just wrecking the game plan, that's their only chance. And it was almost as if the implication was, I'm not really sure they can do it. And to be honest, while I've had high regard for Washington, when we walked out of the stadium, Husky Stadium in Seattle, after they beat Oregon in the regular season, I really believed that team could win the national championship, and I still believe that. But I also had doubts as to whether they could handle Sweat and Murphy. And man, I mean, they kept Penix clean, and it was a really impressive performance, certainly by their brilliant quarterback and receivers, but also by those guys up front and the interior guys, not just the tackles.
Yes, and I think the interior guys, I remember doing some stories, talking to some coaches going into that game, Rece. They really were considered, the tackles were good. They weren't worried about edge pressure. If Washington had worries on its line, they had some injuries at center, I believe, this year, and had to shuffle some guys around, normal stuff that happens in the course of a college football season. I guess I'll counter that point. Sweat and Murphy, unbelievable. I think maybe the best position unit we saw on semifinal Saturday was Michigan's interior defensive line.
Yeah.
If I'm not skipping out a turn here to go there, because in flashing ahead a little bit, I really feel like that surprised a lot of Alabama people and observers. Now, I'm not going to say the coaches were surprised by it, because they obviously spent a couple months watching Mason Graham, Chris Jenkins, Kenneth Grant, Rayshon Benny, even big old Cam Good. Like Michigan won that game by manhandling up front. I believe it was 6 sacks that they ended up with. And now some of that was clever pressures, but the pressures are generated because you have to give so much interior. So again, Washington passed the test against 2 elite interior defensive linemen. Both Sweat and Murphy could end up, I would say they're both top 50 picks, but they could both well end up as first-round picks. Murphy's been hyper-productive. The NFL loves his craftiness. He might not have quite the height, weight, speed. Sweat is a once-a-year physical, just Ted Washington comes to mind. They're just Terrence Cody. Like, there just aren't a lot of humans like that on earth who are as athletic as Tavondre Sweat. So I'll be fascinated to see if Washington is more prepared on the interior than Alabama was. You think back to that last play, Alabama's offensive line just got blown up, and Jalen Hurts got tied. Now, it was a bad snap. Now, how much of Seth McLaughlin's troubles were the fact that he was getting his tail kicked all day, right? Like, and was worried about different assignments and maybe a little bit off. I mean, he clearly had a bad game. There's no other way to say it. And but sometimes there's variable factors there too. Where you're so concerned with which way do I go, who's coming in, where's the blitz coming from, that you're maybe not as focused as getting the ball back and at the right height, which was clearly a struggle.
Well, I will say this about that aspect of it. Michigan's defensive line did just whip Alabama. Alabama's offensive line, and we said this earlier in the season on the podcast, they talked a lot in the preseason. They improved, but their game never quite matched the bravado, and it certainly didn't in the Rose Bowl. But as for the snap issues, that has happened since game 1. And it's really unfortunate to see, because that guy stepped in, Seth McLaughlin, in the 21 SEC championship game and fought his tail off, had a great game against Georgia. And since then has pretty much been the starter. But that's happened since the first game of the season. And I'm not trying to put anything on him. He's entered the transfer portal, I understand.
Yeah.
Which is kind of unfortunate. But you wonder if it's a Steve Sachs, Chuck Knobloch type thing right now.
Yep.
That has become mental because it happened several times. But yeah, Michigan's defensive front was tough, and it's really going to be interesting to see because you don't have the extra days. This is like a regular game week to turn around and get ready. And both winning teams expended a lot of emotional capital. I had one of my closest friends was in the stands. Went to Alabama, was sitting close to a Michigan fan, and after congratulating each other in the aftermath of the game, the Michigan fan said to him, he said, "You didn't need this, we did." And I think there was, when you have a program as proud as Michigan, winningest program in the history of the sport, yet no national championships, nor have they played for one since 1997. That was a split title. Michigan, this is astounding if you stop and think about it.
Yeah.
Michigan hasn't won an outright national championship since 1948. 1948.
Yeah.
And because of the history, not just in the CFP the last 2 years, but their history of failure on the big stage, to have success and the way they had success comes with giving up. And you saw just an explosion of emotion in the aftermath. Now they have to get ready to play one more game. Now, sometimes you do that and you get over the hump, and then you show up the next game, and man, you play your best game. I suspect that's what we're going to get from Michigan. I don't think we're going to get a flat Michigan that left it all on the field in the Rose Bowl. I think we're going to get the best Michigan on Monday night against Washington. Washington, on the other hand, certainly an emotional win, certainly a thrilling one, but felt more like, because of the coming through against Oregon a couple of times and Washington State, the game with the reverse that you mentioned with Rome Odunze, 4th and 1 from their own 29. It felt a little more like, they were happy, but it felt a little more like business as usual. And, it'll be fascinating to see, because I do think getting the feet back on the ground and recovering mentally and emotionally maybe for both teams is almost as important as recovering physically from what, were a couple of bruising games.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point to go from that. You're right. There was a catharsis to the Michigan win that maybe caught me a little bit by surprise, Rece. Now, obviously, I understand the numbers and I understand how they've sort of pushed, and there was obviously like a generation where they really struggled with Ohio State, right? And so I know getting past that was hugely cathartic, but for them on this stage, and obviously, the word adversity was thrown around a lot this week. A lot of that was self-induced, right?
It was.
But
you
it was still.
Stalions was at the game. Did you?
He was at the game. He was at the game. Shaved head. Well, we know this about Connor Stalions. He's a big Michigan fan, right? Like that is one thing. As he emerged in our lives and we learned a lot about him, he loves Michigan. So if you're a big Michigan fan, and he's got some roots in Southern California, didn't he have one of his military bases down there when he was there? So I would fully expect a Connor Stalions sighting in Houston as well. So it seemed as if some of the Michigan folks, I think Chase Winovich, the old DN who played for the Patriots for a minute, put that up on social media. It seems some of them have delighted in him becoming this, he was just sort of a runt around the facility that no one knew what he did for a bunch of years, right? And now he's become this sort of heel and divisive guy. So it seemed to me that there was some snickering at that, a little bit of a middle finger to the establishment from the Michigan folks.
That's terminology. Now, I've always known heel. That's always been a wrestling term. When I was a kid, I liked wrestling. You had the wrestling heels. The one that I didn't know that McAfee has taught me over the course of this season is babyface. The babyface, they're the good guys. I understand it correctly. Babyface is the good guy, and the heels are the bad guys. So
interesting.
In the Rose Bowl, this was talked about a lot, that you had two heels. Really, Michigan because of their off the field, and Alabama because of their history of winning this thing, and also because they were the last team in ahead of Florida State, which conveniently got Texas off the hook, because Texas, had Georgia won, would have also gotten in ahead of Florida State. But you had two heels there. Okay, now that you go, Washington clearly is the baby face, right? In this in this championship game. So they're to the people on the outside, the casual observers who have no horse in the race, they're going to be that. What do you think the reaction will be after all this? You mentioned middle finger to the so-called establishment. Michigan wins the national championship. What do you think the reaction will be generally among college football fans who don't have a team? Not Michigan fans and not Ohio State fans who would root for anybody against Michigan.
I mean, it's always hard to gauge reaction, right? Because fan is short for fanatic, and once you cut out some of the biases, I don't really know what the Oklahoma fan is going to think about it, right? Because it is the instinct of college sports fan bases to point at the weak point, the low moment, the controversy, and not that. I mean, look, if Michigan wins this thing, Rece, they earned it. They have a wonderful roster. They have a transcendent quarterback. Harbaugh called him the greatest at Michigan in Michigan history. Still has a little bit to go to be the greatest Michigan quarterback ever. He's got about 8 Super Bowls left, but I mean he's been remarkable. It's a remarkably constructed roster. I do think the unsung hero of this whole Michigan renaissance since they went 2-4 in COVID is Ben Herbert, their strength coach. That is a team that physically mauled Alabama. And I know this isn't vintage Alabama, but it's still Alabama, and they're pretty good. And so, one of the interesting things about this game is before we went to Washington, Oregon, I talked to some scouts about Washington, and they thought there's probably a dozen maybe Washington players drafted, which is the sign of a playoff team. Oregon had the same. Michigan is a tick ahead of that. Now, again, does McCarthy go? Does he not go? Does Donovan? There's always a few variables. It's always hard to say they're going to have 13 guys drafted because there's 4 or 5 decisions that are going to, dictate where that number goes. But they have built the most NFL talent at a program in the country. They have built the roster. They have developed the roster. And there are guys like Sainristil, who may be my favorite player in college football this year, other than Roma Dunze. They're going to be going up against each other. But he's 5'10", 186, Rece. College football players aren't that size. But he tackles with abandon. He had a couple blitzes the other night that were key. Some of the coaches told me that he blitzes more than the edges do. Edges are obviously going in, but they use him more than the linebackers because of the way he can fly in off the edge. So I just think there will always be, some people poking at this, and quickly the storyline is going to shift to what Harbaugh does, right? So that's going to immediately, if they hold that trophy up, there'll be a day, but then immediately that's going to come into focus here quick, especially with the NFL regular season ending this weekend. It's sort of going to be that there's going to be a collision of those two worlds, right? We're going to know exactly what's open. I mean, the championship game is on Black Monday. How perfect is that, right? The potential options will all be laid out, usually by Tuesday morning, but certainly by Monday night, there'll be the all those dominoes falling. So it's pretty compelling theater, really. You couldn't really write it in any other way. And he could walk off having one of the greatest seasons in Michigan in the last generation. I think it's safe to call it that, no matter the result. Or, he could walk off the field with the trophy above his head and then have an even more compelling decision.
One of the things that I get to do on Tuesday morning following the national championship game is sit down with the winning coach. And should that be Jim Harbaugh, there will be topics that will have to extend beyond Michigan because of just what you're talking about. And it calls to mind a previous encounter that I'd had with Jim when he was at Stanford and right before he left to go to the NFL that time. And everybody knew that was the likelihood and almost a certainty that it was going to happen. And so in the aftermath of Stanford winning in the Orange Bowl, our sideline reporter, if memory serves, it's been a few years ago now, obviously, but I believe it was Michelle Tafoya at the time. And I was presenting the trophy in the Orange Bowl, and Jim sort of got away from Michelle. Not in a bad way. She was interviewing him, and she, was going to ask the question, or did ask the question perhaps, and he sort of ran away, from him and said, talk to this guy. Like he does a lot, like he did on the trophy stand the other night. He wants you to talk to the players, but there was a method to the madness, right? And so when I had him on the trophy stand, because we're on TV too, we're not just playing to the house, he didn't answer the question, from Michelle Tafoya. So after we talked about Stanford winning and all of that, I asked him the question. And, he kind of went, respect the game, all of this stuff went into it, and people thought we were angry with one another. When in reality, then I went over to do post game with Mark May and Lou Holtz, and Andrew Luck and a lot of the Stanford players raced up there to storm the set while we were waiting to go. And Jim walked over and friendly as could be. And I remember saying to him, Jim, if you'd answered Michelle, then I wouldn't have had to ask in front of everybody. And sort of fast forward to I think it was a Fiesta Bowl where Chip Kelly was in the same situation. And I got called in, was not originally scheduled to host that. Some unfortunate circumstances surrounding it that I had to go in and pinch hit. So I didn't get a chance to talk to Chip Kelly ahead of time, but I sent word to him and said, if he doesn't want to answer the question on the podium, he needs to answer it when the sideline reporter asked it after the game. And he did. And, but there won't be any of that opportunity on Tuesday if the answer is, if the question is for Jim Harbaugh, and
yes,
he'll have to, I'm sure.
Is Bonnie Bernstein and Roy Williams the most famous one of those? Do you remember that?
Yeah, probably. So I don't. Which Roy told a fib because he clearly, he clearly did give an S about Carolina because he's still going to the games. So he clearly cares very deeply, and we all knew he did. But I also understood the sentiment, and I also understand the awkward nature of it. It's and I understand. I even understand fans, Pete, who go, "Can't you just let him have the moment?" I understand, but it's sort of like as I've worked with you, you're the consummate professional. You break more stories than anybody in your space, and you can't miss the opportunity because the thing is you look terrible, and some of it is self-preservation for sure. But if I, for instance, go back to all those years ago with Harbaugh. If I hadn't said anything, he had run away from Michelle, and then I didn't follow up by actually asking the question. Who's to say he doesn't walk into the press conference and say, "This has been awesome. I love Stanford. Sure. Thank you. I'm the head coach of the 49ers." Who's to say that? I mean, you can't risk that, and it's a bad spot. I get it. It's a terrible spot for the coaches. I get it. We'd rather it be nice and clean too. To be honest with you, we'd rather be able to just talk about just this right now. But it's sort of in human nature to look to see what's next and what it means for the program. I mean, all the years that I've had Nick Saban in there, you look back, you also look forward every time. They beat Georgia on that walk-off Tua to Devontae throw, and part of the next morning was, what are you going to do about Tua and Jalen Hurts? Sure. That's just the way it is. It's unfortunate, but that's just sort of the nature of the beast.
I do think it's really interesting, Rece, for the listener, because I remember when the Bonnie Bernstein, Roy Williams thing happened, she came out and said, I told him I was going to ask him the question. Mm-hmm. Like, these coaches are not unprepared for these questions. And they have to know what's happening. And while Michigan fans could have a right to say, oh, why are you asking Jim about his future? We just won the national championship, lost the national championship, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Like, the reality is 85% of the people watching are much more interested in that than him giving platitudes to Trevor Keegan or something, right? Correct. So because there's a whole look, did you see the ratings numbers? I mean, like 27 million people are watching. Obviously, a lot of Michigan fans, right? Big fan base. But for the most part, there's a lot of casual fans who are more interested in some of the bigger picture things that have happened at Michigan this season that are going to happen there. And again, those things need to be addressed. But nobody's getting surprised by this stuff, right? And I do think, especially when you're doing like a podium situation or the sideline reporters, like there is a lot of communication behind the scenes over what's going to happen here. So nobody's flat-footed or gobsmacked in that moment. But I agree. Like, I've sat there in press conferences and been like, I guess nobody's going to ask this controversial question that all anybody really cares about is that answer, right? Like, that's the news of this. And so you raise your hand and you ask the question, and then you get some dirty looks, sometimes from the PR people, sometimes from like the local rival scout guys who are partisan. But it's just sort of part of what we're doing here.
And I think the thing is too is that when we also know what the answer is going to be many times. Yes. You try to ask the question in an open, neutral, lean fashion, which you're not, assigning any value to the question or taking a side on it. But you kind of know that they're going to dodge it because they know it's coming. But it has to be asked because sometimes they don't dodge it. And sometimes they do say, or sometimes in their non-answer, there's an answer. So, all of those things are part of it as well. There's a pretty good history of guys in their second season having great moments. And Kalen DeBoer has already had a ton of those. And he has a wealth of championship experience. And, one of the things that I've sort of tried to emphasize over the years when you talk about whether it's Kalen or Lance Leipold having success or Chris Kleiman or whoever it might be, is that people often dismiss success at lower levels of college football and say, well, that's not the big time. It's not Pac-12. And, well, Kalen DeBoer didn't take, the equivalent of Georgia's roster down to Sioux Falls and start dominating, with it. He outcoached people. And he has a terrific roster now. He's got a veteran, smart, talented, ridiculously savvy quarterback who is not going to for instance, I'll make this comparison. I don't think the All-22 is going to be terribly kind to Jalen Milroe about the ability to beat some of those pressures. Mm-hmm. That won't happen to Michael Penix. So, so Michigan is going to have to do different things, and Michael Penix is going to be able to execute answers quickly, more quickly than Jalen Milroe was able to. That's going to present an entirely different challenge. I also don't feel as if, because of DeBoer's experience in championship games, regardless of the level, because of the way Washington showed up in Vegas and the way they played and what felt like the parts that I was able to listen to and watch back felt like largely a Texas crowd in New Orleans, a near road game type, and still they came right up, and he's dropping dimes in the bucket 45 yards down the field. I don't think they're going to be overwhelmed by the moment in the least. And I think we've got the potential for a classic game, because just as we spent the weeks leading up to Michigan and Alabama saying that Michigan hadn't seen anyone like Jalen Milroe, and it's true, and they answered that challenge and controlled him, they certainly haven't seen anyone like Michael Penix. They have seen receivers like the receivers they're going to see. They saw them from Ohio State, but probably not the same level of quarterback play that they're going to see on Monday night.
Yeah, and I would think, obviously, Harrison and Dunze, I would say, at least are comparable, meaning one's the third pick in the draft and one's the 13th, right? Like, they are comparable highest end in the sport this year. I would argue maybe a healthy McMillan, and Polk really popped, I thought, in that game on Monday night. I would think 1, 2, 3, they're a cut above Ohio State this year, especially because Igbuka was not who we knew him to be going into the season.
Fair enough, but it's not this vast expanse between.
Correct. No. If I had to split hairs, I would give the Huskies crew an edge.
Me too. No question.
In that, and you wonder if, as we start to dial in on some of the intricacies here, obviously, Will Johnson, your favorite player in college football this year, at least your favorite defensive back, will be first-team All-American, one of the faces of the sport in 2024. I was asking some of the coaches who played Michigan. Well, Josh Wallace, the UMass transfer, is a step below. Right now, he had a huge tackle in that game on the third down prior to the fourth down in overtime, but. Okay, how come you can't exploit Wallace? And the answer is interesting to me, because simpletons like me will be like, well, one guy's good and one guy's not as good, so can't you just get the matchup? And the point was this: it was the way Michigan plays defense is a pure NFL. Like, the safeties are safeties; they're like 20 yards back. Now that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it is. Keep in front. So if someone is trying to exploit Wallace, they have systems in place, if you will, from those deep safeties, from help, to make sure that he may not be exploited in coverage. But I do think that the energy that 1, 2, 3 give you at receiver by Washington will test Michigan, and combined with Penix's unbelievable accuracy, his ability to go outside the numbers, his ability to stretch the field, I think that's going to stretch Michigan in a way they haven't been stressed this year. I will say this, after Marvin Harrison Jr. and some of the crew at Ohio State, the receivers in the Big Ten were not good this year, Rece. They're just, I would think only Roman Wilson's good. Obviously, he'll get drafted. And maybe Cornelius Johnson, but that doesn't count for Michigan. Who they saw in the Big Ten this year, there may only be one or two draftable receivers from the whole league that they saw. Now, look, there could be a 7th-round pick at Merritt. You could argue it, but for the most part, as first-day guys that they saw, I would only think it's Marvin Harrison. So, again, it's going to be a little different. There may not be as likely to blitz some of the secondary guys, blitz the nickel, because they're going to have to be a bit more concerned in coverage. The one thing about Jesse Minter in doing a bunch of these scouting reports about Michigan last 2 years after he came up from Vanderbilt was that he's really exotic on third down. Very basic, safeties back first and second down. Third down, he gets creative. One time against Alabama the other night, I noticed they blitzed 2 defensive backs on the same side. That's not, I don't know a lot about blitzing, but that's not normal. So again, they get a little they get a little creative. They keep you off balance. And I agree with your point completely. Michael Penix Jr. is going to be much more prepared to handle that and has the outlets and the skill to push them through. So I think that's a really interesting matchup. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I don't know which way I'm leaning in the game. I mean, a few weeks ago, I think I would have leaned Michigan. I probably will continue leaning that way, but I'm kind of through. I don't know that as I've said, I've thought Washington could win the national championship since we saw them in person, but I will confess to saying that I thought Oregon would get them the second time. I thought Texas would get them, not blow them out, but I thought they would win the game. Thought Oregon would win the game. They didn't, and so I'm kind of over doubting Washington right now because they have weapons on offense and the ability to do things that are at least in the same realm of the Joe Burrow LSU team, the Alabama team with Mac Jones and all of those receivers when Sark was running that and you couldn't stop them. Washington has that same type of vibe on offense right now, and you combine it with a little bit of a run game too, and it's been it's been really impressive to watch, and I think it can give them an opportunity to win the national championship. We'll have a few more days to look forward to Michigan and Washington. I'm really excited about the game, the entire atmosphere in Houston for sure. But, Pete, that's not your only focus over the next few days. The quarterback transfer portal, the transfer portal as a whole, but the focus always tends to be on quarterbacks. What will be the biggest news, the biggest things that happen over the next couple of days, or likely to happen is a better way to put it?
So, as we tape right now on Thursday, January 4th in the morning, Will Howard is on a visit to Ohio State. The timeline is instructive here, Rece. He visited Miami almost 2 weeks ago now, went to USC, has taken a long look at the NFL. I was told a Senior Bowl invite just came in the last 24 hours. So Will Howard has good options. And the fact that he waited until after Ohio State's bowl game, they wanted to give Devin Brown a chance to start, seems to me an indicator of how strong a mutual interest is between those two sides. Now, Big Ten fans may not be that familiar with Will Howard. We were lucky enough to see him in the Big 12 title game last year, Rece. I really think he's a big-time talent. He's a dual threat guy. I think he has 19 rushing touchdowns. He started 27 games. This is going to sound funny, but he struggled in 2020 and 2021. He got thrust in, right? Mm-hmm. And he said in interviews in the past, didn't really know what was going on. It's COVID, everybody's hurt, people were missing games. And I really, a quarterback who struggled, I think it really helps their development in a lot of ways because they learn quickly that they know what they don't know. Will Howard, 12-5 as a starter the last 2 years. And remember, this season, lost to Missouri on the thicker kicker 61-yarder and lost to overtime to Texas in Austin. So a very good player who brings a little more dual threat than Kyle McCord. It will be interesting to see if Ohio State can close the deal. It seems to be trending that way, and we'll see if that gets done and he goes in for one season and maybe offers a bridge to Brown or a bridge to Lincoln Kienholz and gives the Buckeyes a new face for 2024.
Some of the other teams, now there are guys who've already picked their spots. Tyler Van Dyke is gone from Miami. He's gone to Wisconsin. As I'm thinking here, and Cam Ward declared for the NFL and DJU is going to Florida State. What's Miami doing? Where's Miami's situation right now?
I actually spent a bunch of time on that over the weekend and last night. Now, Cam Ward, Rece, I would just say he has declared he's going pro, but until he signs with an agent, he's been a little all over the place throughout this process, and quite frankly, it's frustrated some of the schools he's been engaged with. Until he either signs with an agent or plays in an postseason All-Star game, he can go back to school. So in theory, he could also potentially end up at a place like Michigan if J.J. McCarthy goes there. Michigan would obviously look to the portal for someone with experience. They don't have anyone on that roster who started a game. And McCarthy is no sure thing to go to the NFL, but boy, if he wins and he's 27-1, I believe they lose. All 5 of their offensive linemen are either seniors or graduates, if you look at the roster. Now, who has what left with red shirts and COVID, I'm not sure. I think Hinton, a backup, is going to come back for them this year. But they are looking at an overhaul at tailback, an overhaul at receiver, and an extreme overhaul at the offensive line, which would indicate they probably it would be hard to continue at his 95% winning clip from there. It's just, again, they've done great in the portal, a lot of faith in that coaching staff, obviously, especially after the way they creatively called that game on Saturday, and they've been able to rebuild after a couple Joe Moore award-winning offensive lines. But it feels like there's going to be a pause here for Michigan to reset. But I think if McCarthy does go, a new quarterback would certainly have to be part of that equation. So that's a long way to say for Miami, they also may wait. The market is flooded right now with quarterbacks. I've been getting calls the last couple of days. Hey, where should I go? What should I do? Like there is uncertainty because there just aren't a lot of landing spots where you can start for certain. In Miami right now, I would say, is probably the best destination in terms of a school and certainly in terms of NIL that could bring in a frontline guy. Do they wait until after spring? Now, remember, last spring, the quarterback market was pretty dry. Mm-hmm. Like, everybody was sort of waiting for it to drop. Remember, there was the Van Dyke to Alabama rumors that were sort of percolated for a couple of days, but there was never a frontline guy that went in the portal. And look, I understand that, right, Rece? It's hard to go through 15 spring practices and be the leader of the team and then say, peace out, guys, I'm going to chase some NIL money. That's just a hard thing to do as a human. I'm not saying it won't happen, and I'm saying it can't happen, but I'm saying that from a human perspective, that's a difficult thing to do. So I think Miami is being patient, and I think they're waiting to see how some options could unfold. Talia Tagovailoa has not declared for the draft yet. Would he be able to petition the NCAA and get another year? He could all of a sudden become a very coveted guy in this quarterback market if that happens. But he would need a waiver. That would need to come by, I think, January 15th or 16th is the date. I believe it's the 15th. So there are still sort of options, but I don't feel like Miami is locked in on anyone right now, Rece. And they feel like, from a program, they're a frontline quarterback away from competing in the ACC. They've got a strong offensive line, good defensive line. They've recruited well. Front seven's really good. They feel like the talent is upgraded everywhere. 2 good returning receivers, except at that quarterback position, they need a bridge to some of the younger guys.
If Leah is granted that waiver, then, I mean, I've got no intel or insight, but knowing the dynamics surrounding the entire situation, he's going to Miami. I mean, yeah, that would be it would be shocking if he gets the waiver. And although he is an independent sort of dude. I mean, in some ways, he he was looking to carve his own path coming out of high school, and sort of acquiesced and spent a year with Tua at Alabama before moving on after that. So we'll see what happens with him. Big Ten's all-time leading passer certainly would be a great place to start for Miami. And there might be more coming after that. One thing we didn't talk about, I know you had some travel issues. How'd you get home, or how'd you get back to the hotel from the Rose Bowl the other night?
Oh, Adrian was very kind to pack us all in her Corolla and rolled us down to the ESPN offices, and I took an Uber from the JW Marriott downtown.
Did you know that she was very nervous about having you in her car?
I did not know that.
Very
Why?
nervous.
It was a fine automobile that got us buzzed us right through that LA traffic. And we talked about her working at Court TV for a lot of years, and seeing America through a very intriguing prism.
She was worried that her car was going to break down, Pete. And
really?
And that you would be upset,
Adrian?
And that you would be upset.
Oh, but it's pretty hard to upset me.
Well, I assured
other than
her,
when I get scooped.
I assured her that had the car broken down anywhere in the vast expanse of Los Angeles, that either the graduate assistant to the strength coach at UCLA or an assistant basketball coach at Loyola Marymount would have scurried right over and picked you all up and probably had the car fixed by the time Adrian got back to her home.
Hopefully brought some in and out, too. Let's be honest. I was hungry.
You had no idea you make people nervous like that. I think you probably know you make coaches and agents nervous, but other than that, you didn't know you did that, did you?
I hope I didn't have like a big looming. I was grateful for the ride. As you know, the Rose Bowl is one of the most wonderful places on earth to watch a football game, and it is one of the most logistically challenging places on earth to get in and out of. So I didn't want to be sitting there at Arroyo at 10 o'clock at night the other night, trying to find that. So I was very grateful for getting a scoot out of Pasadena. So we appreciate you, Adrian. Welcome to the team. It's hard to get me mad, by the way. Like it would really take quite a bit to upset me.
Adrian, you were on Court TV, but Jim Harbaugh prefers Judge Judy. Do you realize? Everybody knows Judge Judy made bank. I don't even know if she's still on. I think she is, but all the other judges do too, like this Judge Joe Brown guy and some of the other Judge TV shows, probably the People's Court if that's still on. Judge Judy was making like 45, and Judge Joe Brown was like 38 or some
$45 million a year.
Yes, am I right? I'm right, aren't I, Adrian? Right?
Is her robe like crusted in diamonds?
It should be. So let's right here before we go here. I'm going to go. I'm Googling as we speak because we don't have a Google expert sitting here that I can yell out like some podcasts do.
I don't know how much
so I'm
she
gonna
was
go,
making. We're,
how much
to
does
clarify,
Judge Judy make? And we'll pop up. Here it is. Judy earned a whopping $47 million per year through her annual contract with CBS. Here, the story here. There's something from just a few months ago. Judge Judy, her show, and the story behind her $480 million net worth. 480, Pete. 480. Do you know if I don't know where Judge Judy went to school. Do you know what she could do to their NIL program, to their collective?
Yeah, that's a lot of Tagovailoas like she could find. Like that's she could endow the best NIL program in the country with that.
If Judge Judy,
I wonder where she went to college.
I'm looking right now. Do you know if Judge Judy if this pops up that she's a Florida State alum, they are out of the ACC instantly. The Court TV has the actual trials, and maybe Judy goes a little bit more. I can't find in the Wikipedia thing her alma mater to see who she might.
American, I think. American.
Yeah. Oh, well, then that basketball program is about to take off now that she's been challenged here on the college Game Day podcast. I think that
get a couple stretch fours for 400 large.
That's probably a good sign that we have reached the end of our endeavors here. That I'm Googling for Judge Judy's alma mater. It's American. Did Taylor come through with that? Taylor is so
joint effort. My wife a proud American Eagle, so she taught me that.
All right.
Taylor was so hoping it said Maryland, but alas.
It's a lot of yellow pants and a lot of yellow ugly flag uniforms for that. Yeah, she's worth more than Kevin Plank.
That's
tough. That's a tough pill to swallow.
Under Armour guru. For sure, and all around good guy, friend of the National Football Foundation too. We hope that we are friends of football. We're certainly friends of yours, and you're friends of ours. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day Podcast. We urge you to subscribe, download the podcast wherever you want to download it, and then coming up this weekend, we'll have a championship game preview, and I promise not to mention Judge Judy or Court TV, maybe, possibly. Well, there's a decent chance.